We're finishing up the book. Well, we've grown this person up from a baby, and we squired them through old age, and now it's of course the end. So everybody dies so far. There's no 15,000-year-old people out there, so everybody dies. Humans live for somewhere in the range of 120 seems to be the maximum number of years that people live. So there you go. Just a thought. So let's go ahead and get started. Dusk of Life, Chapter 13. We're going to talk about death. As recently as the turn of the 20th century, 50 out of every 1,000 people in the United States died every year. That's a lot of people. Uh, I'm talking about 1900 here. We're not talking about 2001. In Europe, during plagues and natural disasters, as many as 40% of the population might die. One third of all babies died in infancy. One third of all babies died in infancy, and this is in 1900. 50% of children died before their 10th birthday. That means if you gave birth to six kids, then probably three of them would have made it to their 10th birthday. Death was normal and it was expected, and it was all over the place. People died of diseases, childhood diseases. And when we were talking about vaccinations, that's the reason that we vaccinate babies, is so that they won't die like they used to. We used to lose kids in measles epidemics and mumps epidemics. Chicken pox, well, maybe not chicken pox. People used to die of whooping cough. They used to die of tetanus. My goodness, I mean, people were just dropping like flies. Somebody got sick and developed pneumonia. That was your ticket out of here. That was normally what killed people off, was pneumonia. Until we developed antibiotics, and now we can fight pneumonia. Now we understand what viruses are, so we can fight measles, mumps, chickenpox. We can vaccinate you against all of these things. That's what happened with COVID. COVID was killing off millions of people around the world, and I think 3 million is the number. Is the last number I saw. Over a million people in the United States. Killed over a million people in the United States. And now we have a vaccine against it. So that's what was happening before. You might think nostalgically. I do not. I was born in 1949. When I was young, I had measles, I had mumps, and I had chickenpox. And now, of course, you vaccinated all your kids against that, and they never had any of those diseases. When I was young, there was polio, and polio was killing people, and it was crippling people. And luckily, I didn't get sick. But they didn't come up with a vaccine until 1953. Well, I was born in 1949. I could very easily have been one of those kids with one leg shorter than the other, with one leg that didn't work. That's what was happening when I was a baby. Anyway, humans and death. During the 20th century, advances in medicine, from surgical techniques to antibiotics, reduced death rates and increased life expectancies all over the world. Death rates have now fallen to 9%, and infant mortality is below 1% in the United States. Remember what we said before? One third of all babies died in infancy. One third. That's 33%. Now it's less than 1%. Children rarely succumb to childhood illnesses. Adults most often live to retire. And older individuals now are given the medicines to fight off formerly fatal illnesses. Now, I'm going to admit something to you. When I was a kid, I used to read the obituaries because I was fascinated to thinking about how long I would get to live. That was really interesting. So I used to read the obituaries, and back then they used to put people's ages when they died. And I can remember lots of people dying of lung cancer in their 40s, or lung cancer in their 50s, or cancer in their 60s. This was very common back when I was a kid. And it's mostly because we didn't have the surgical techniques we have today. We didn't have the antibiotics. Somebody died of pneumonia. This was really common. They used to tell you what people died of back then. They don't do that anymore for one reason or another, but they used to tell you back then. And I used to read this stuff because I was fascinated. I was worried about my parents. How long will my parents live? Are they going to be around? Gee, I'd hate for my sister to have to take care of me because she's really mean. She was really mean. I was a lot happier with my parents taking care of me than my sister taking care of me. My older sister. I have two older sisters, but my oldest sister, let me say that. Anyway, so yeah, things are so much better than they used to be. The first generation to reach adulthood with only 5% of the population ever experiencing death in their presence was the baby boom generation. That's my generation. My brothers and sisters saw my older brother and sisters actually saw my grandparents die in our house. I was born in 1949. They were all gone by the time I got there. Why? Because, well, that's just the way it worked. They died of pneumonia. One died, this is my paternal grandfather and grandmother. They died within a week of one another. Only 1 in 3 people died at home back then. People rarely thought of their own deaths. Today, however, death tends to be getting closer to people as violence, drug abuse, COVID-19, and AIDS becomes more prevalent. There are at least 3 aspects of death: biological death, social death, and psychological death. Biological definition of death is when the bodily functions cease, the heart stops beating, the person stops breathing, and brain activity stops. Now, I've been in on this. I've seen thousands of people. I've watched thousands of people die, and this is usually how in the hospital we determine if somebody is dead. We have a heart monitor. We don't really look at their respiration, but we do look at their brain activity to see if there's any movement going on. Are they alive or are they dead? And we can keep people going for a really long time. I used to work in a hospital where we were the ones that harvested the organs for heart and liver and lung and kidney transplants, and this is all on one road, one street in Omaha, and we were at one end of the street, and then there was Clarkson and UNMC, yeah, University of Nebraska Medical Center. They would transplant. They would transplant organs into people, and we were the ones that held the individuals until we could harvest everything. We were at the end of the street. As macabre as that may sound, but that's what we did. And our hospital was a Catholic hospital, and Clarkson was a Catholic hospital. And if they didn't need the heart or lungs or kidneys or whatever at Clarkson, then we'd send it down to UNMC. I know that sounds gross, doesn't it? I'm laughing. Social death is basic social attitudes toward death, and the psychological attitudes toward death are both the dying and the bereaved. How do they deal with death? Before modern medicine allowed physicians to maintain a dying patient indefinitely, biological death took place when the heart stopped beating and respiration ceased. The brain was starved for oxygen and all living functions stopped. Now we have the capability of breathing for an individual and maintaining a heartbeat indefinitely. Life support can be maintained indefinitely despite the fact that the brain has no awareness. Now, interestingly enough, what happened a couple months ago? A couple months ago, they had a pig, and the pig died, and they held it for a while, and then they were able to bring the pig back to life. Despite the fact it hadn't had any circulation for over an hour, they were able to bring the pig back to life. And of course, that made people question just when do we die? What has to happen in order for us to die? If the heart stops beating and the brain is starved for oxygen, does that mean that something is dead? And the answer this may be a moving target. We may be changing all of this because of that pig, as weird as that sounds. Can we do the same thing with humans? And the answer is probably not, because the brain, once it's starved for oxygen, the brain dies. Did that happen with the pig? Well, it's very difficult to ask pigs questions. Because of our ability to maintain people indefinitely, the AMA developed a new definition for death: irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function. Normally what happens when you die, and I've been in on this too, normally when you die, your blood clots, and it's not liquid anymore. It starts to settle out. It really doesn't clot, but yeah. And I've had to draw blood from people that were dead. And of course, there's no blood pressure, so you have to actually draw it out. And once, anyway, we won't go into that. You guys don't need to know that. Irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. However, people can live for an extended period of time with only their brain stem functioning, a state referred to as a persistent vegetative state. Social aspects of death and dying. Many social aspects of death and dying are governed by religious or legal prescriptions that tend to reflect a society's attitude toward death. Embalming is a social custom that has become a law in most states. The Jewish practice of standing watch, or shomer, over the deceased until they are buried is also a social custom. When I was up at Fort Belknap, they would stand, not Shiva, that's Jewish. They would have a wake, and the wake would sometimes last for 2 or 3 days, where they'd bring the body in a casket into an open area. And especially if they were veterans, then people had to, a veteran had to stand watch over the body 24 hours a day. It's really kind of interesting. Of course, I always got the bad shift, but yeah. And then people would come in, and they would talk about the dead. They'd usually talk about happy things. People weren't coming in to cry. They were usually talking about some of the nice things that the individual had done, or whatever. Psychological aspects of death. Psychologists feel that people use rituals surrounding death to give themselves something to do when someone dies, instead of feeling hopeless. Some rituals allow for extended contact with the dying or dead and reaffirm the strength and efficacy of the community. In the Jewish community, friends and relatives gather at the deathbed to lend support to the dying, and this is known as Vidui and Shema. And we're going to talk about what else they do. It's really kind of interesting because I had a friend who was Navajo up on the Fort Belknap reservation, and his wife died, and because your traditions about death and how you deal with death are different from their traditions, it really became a little bit controversial, because Dave had to leave right after his wife died, and people were kind of upset up there because normally, their whole process is very much different. They have a wake, and her wake lasted for 3 or 4 days, and he stuck around for the 3 or 4 days, but then he left. And what normally happens, he was a big powwow guy, and what normally happens is that people don't dance. People don't dance for a year after after somebody dies, but then after a year, somebody dances them back into the circle. But Dave left, and Dave didn't come back, even though he had kids there. Most of them were grown and had families of their own. But Dave came back down, or he went back down to Arizona, uh, because their idea of what he needed to do and his idea of what he needed to do were very much different. So, really kind of curious. And everybody's wondering where Dave is. Where's Dave? Everybody loved Dave. He was such a nice guy. He is such a nice guy. I'm assuming he's still with us. In the Jewish community, when a friend or relative dies and someone hears of their death, they ritually tear an article of clothing that they will wear for the rest of the day, and this is known as keri ah. After the funeral, a group of male relatives, at least 7, will gather and share and vent feelings of the deceased. This is known as sitting Shiva. All of these rituals help the bereaved confront the reality of death. So they have a formula for what you have to do if you're Jewish. The study of death is called thanatology. Many people believe that people must not only learn to deal with the death of someone close to themselves, but also their own death as well. And this is death education. Hospice care is care given to someone in a controlled setting, but outside the hospital. Some hospice care is provided in special housing where medical care is available. Other hospice care is at home by medical professionals. And my mother-in-law died, and before she died, she had hospice care in our house. This was in Mississippi, and they did a really nice job. They were really sweet people. Who had lots of things to do. I mean, there were lots of people in hospice care, but they came by whenever we needed help. They would come by and bathe her at certain points. She was still fairly lucid, but she couldn't bathe herself, so they would bathe her. They did a really good job. They told us the day she died that she was probably died that day because her circulation was so poor. And they had been there that day. As soon as she was getting worse and worse and worse, they came every day. So, really helped. Throughout most of the 20th century, medicine allowed people to get farther and farther from death. People died in a hospital away from all but the closest relatives. But the AIDS epidemic in the early 80s changed all that as more and more people contracted the nearly always fatal disease and expired slowly. The process of slowly declining to death is referred to as a death trajectory. And of course, I was in on this because I was working in medicine in the 80s. I can remember when we had our first AIDS patient at the hospital where I was working. That's the hospital that was doing all the transplanting. Of course, we wouldn't transplant an AIDS patient, but they would come in, and then we would put them into a form of hospice care because they didn't need to be at the hospital, and normally they wouldn't really go through crises. Normally, what would happen is they would come in, we would diagnose them, we would set them up with a certain regimen as to what they needed to do in order to prolong their lives, and then they would find an avenue to do what they needed to do in order to survive, and that's the way it worked. If they ever did go into crisis, they'd come back. We had a special ward for the care. At that time, we didn't really know what AIDS was, and at that time we had no way of detecting whether somebody had AIDS. Well, we could tell that they had AIDS. The problem was we couldn't check blood. We couldn't find out if there was if the virus was spreading. The way that we told how bad they were was to do T cells. We counted T cells at the time. And of course, I worked in the lab, so we were the ones counting the T cells. And so we got involved in all of this. But the AIDS epidemic really changed everything. Nobody knew exactly what was going on. It was kind of like the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we really identified it very well, and we didn't know what was going to happen and how long you lived or what it did to you. That was what was happening with the AIDS epidemic. Lingering pattern of dying, the individual is expected to die but clings to life longer than expected. And this is what was happening in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. They didn't just get sick and die. They got sick and it took them, it took them months to get worse and then to finally expire. Short reprieve pattern, the person's death is postponed unexpectedly. Cancer goes into remission, but the reprieve tends to be short-lived. Abrupt surprise pattern, the individual is expected to recover, but unexpectedly dies. And this happened with somebody just recently. They sent them to the hospital. They thought they were going to recover, and he ended up dying. It was somebody that was really old. Suspended sentence pattern, a person is in the hospital to die but is suddenly discharged from medical care because the crisis has passed, and sometimes we can fight these things off. Re-entry pattern, the person steadily declines but is able to remain home between periods of hospitalization, and that's normally what we see with people in hospice care. That's usually a terminal cancer, a tumor, especially the pancreatic cancer is one of those diseases that are really hard to deal with. A lot of leukemias are that way. People will go into remission. The terminally ill will often pass through three phases. The acute phase is a crisis that causes high stress and increases awareness of the inevitability of death. The chronic phase is an adjustment period when the individual resolves their feelings toward their own demise. And then the terminal phase is where the individual withdraws from others and disengages from the world. And actually, this is called terminal drop, and I've seen this a lot. Terminal drop. I worked in a children's hospital in Omaha, and we had a cancer ward. We had a leukemia ward at the children's hospital, and we used to see this a lot with the children as they were dying. They would withdraw and disengage from people, even their parents. Really tough for the parents. When the individual enters the terminal phase of the death process, often you will notice marked accelerated cognitive degeneration. This is called terminal drop or terminal decline when the focus tends to be inward and the individual stops eating or drinking, or at least has to be reminded to eat or drink. Especially drinking, they become dehydrated, and that's not really very good. It just accelerates the whole process. Old people have a hard time remembering to hydrate anyway. But when they get sick, it's wow. Trying to get them to drink is not the easiest thing in the world. The top 10 causes of death in the United States in 1900. The top cause of death was pneumonia. Tuberculosis was number 2. Diarrhea and enteritis was number 3. Heart disease was number 4. Number 5 was chronic nephritis, Bright's disease. It's a disease of the kidneys. Unintentional injury, accidents, such as accidents. Remember, there were no cars in 1900. Stroke was number 7. Diseases of early infancy was number 8. Cancer was number 9. And diphtheria was number 10. You may wonder, why in the world, what happened with cancer? Cancer is a leading cause of death now. What's going on with cancer? Why were people not dying of cancer? And the answer is because people weren't living long enough to get cancer. They were dying of other things. If a disease came through like tuberculosis or dysentery or something affected their kidneys, they died of that. Or they died of mumps, measles, chickenpox, whatever was whooping cough, which is whatever was coming down the road. Okay, so that's the 10 leading causes of death in 1900. Leading cause of death in the United States of people over 40 today. Cancer is number one. Heart disease is number two. Cancer, about 31.5% of the people that die of cancer. Why are they dying of cancer now? And they weren't dying of cancer in 1900 because people weren't living long enough to catch cancer. It took us forever to figure out what dementia and Alzheimer's disease was. Why? Because people weren't living long enough to start suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Number three is unintentional injuries, about 7.6%. Poisoning, motor vehicle accidents, falls. Number four is it's a tie between diabetes and cerebrovascular disease or strokes, about 3.6%. So you can see that people are living longer. None of these diseases have any, or none of these problems have any thing to do with bacteria. They're all just something that happens to you. Cancer is not caused by a bacteria or a virus. Heart disease is not caused by a bacteria or a virus. Certainly injuries, unintentional injuries. Diabetes, of course, is not caused by bacteria or a virus. Or cerebrovascular disease, not caused by anything. Pneumonia, of course, is caused by a bacteria. So is tuberculosis. Diarrhea is normally caused by a bacteria as well. Now, of course, we have antibiotics, so we can treat all three of these. Chronic nephritis can be caused by a bacteria. It can be caused by sexually transmitted infections. So as you can see, diphtheria, of course, is a bacteria as well. So you can see a lot of these diseases had to do with the fact that we couldn't fight off the bacteria or the virus. People face their own death differently. In young adulthood, people tend to feel invulnerable. They maintain a personal fable that they'll never die. Thus, when other adolescents die, the usual reaction is, it can't and won't happen to me. While this attitude tends to become more realistic and more responsibility the individual acquires, job and family, there is still an air of invulnerability in their actions. By the time someone reaches middle adulthood, they are usually resolved that they will someday die. These individuals begin looking at how much time they have left instead of toward the future. People begin planning for retirement and accumulating money to see them through in their old age. Middle-aged individuals begin working towards saving as much time in their life as possible. The phrase "life is just too short" starts entering the vocabulary, and this is in middle adulthood. As people get older and move into late adulthood, they become less anxious about death. They're more likely to use emotion-focused coping strategies. With the mounting losses of friends and relatives, the individual gradually recognizes their own mortality. And hopefully you've recognized it by this time. About half the people in my high school graduating class are gone. About a third of the people in my college graduating class are no longer alive, including all the African Americans. There were 12 to 15 African Americans in my class. There's only 2 guys left that are African American. That's pretty severe if you think about it. And if you take, what's the class? Social psych? Or is it cultural psych? One of the two, we talk about the John Henry effect, which has to do with professional African American men dying younger than people that aren't professionals. And it's because of the stress of being around people that aren't African American all the time. Many are old and infirm, but they seem to be coping with their situation. We're talking about older people. 2 out of 3 people surveyed as to whether they would trade good health to die earlier took the time alive over the good health. They would rather live a long time, even if it meant they had to live with pain and disease. Approaching death, psychological changes often take place even before there are overt physiological signs of dying. Terminal drop often appears at this time. It is the acceptance of mortality, the seeming impairment of intellectual abilities, and the distancing oneself from friends and family. Terminal drop is often attributed to chronic ailments, but it is seen in people of all ages who are near death, not just the old. And like I said, we used to see it in kids. I can remember we had a 3-year-old that was dying of leukemia, and of course her mother was having a difficult time with it. Her father had disappeared because he didn't want to deal with it. And pretty soon it was really kind of interesting because there was a lab tech who got really close to her, and he wanted to be the one to always draw her blood because he knew that he wouldn't hurt her and that it would be okay. And she got really close to him. She always asked for Dave. Where's Dave? That kind of thing. But when she started her terminal drop, she not only pulled away from her mother, but she pulled away from Dave too. And at that point, I had to be the one to go in and draw her blood if she needed blood drawn. And that was okay with her. She embraced me because she didn't like me. she didn't have the feelings for me she had for Dave. There was this lady, the meanest lady in the world, and she would go in and draw her blood as well. But the two of us, she didn't feel close to, so it was okay for us to go in. She wouldn't let Dave even in the room. She'd start screaming if he tried to come into the room. Of course, it broke his heart, but that's just what was going on. That's what needed to happen. As curious as that is. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross from Cornell University did studies on thanatology and discovered that most people go through 5 stages before they die. The first stage is denial. I ain't dying. The second one is, man, this really pisses me off. The fact that I'm going to die. It really makes me angry. The third stage is bargaining. If I can just have 2 extra days, I would do anything. I'll do anything for 2 extra days. The fourth stage is depression because the bargaining didn't work. Obviously, the denial didn't work. The anger didn't do you any good. The bargaining hasn't worked. So then they go into depression. But most people ultimately will accept their own death. And like I've said, I've watched thousands of people die. And almost to an individual, they accepted death as it approached them. Thanatologists have discovered that people actually attempt to hold on to life until they can reach a certain milestone date. Very often the milestone date is a birthday or anniversary. They want to be 1 year old, as old as they can possibly be. So they'll try to hang on to their birthday. If you've ever noticed how I do this all the time when I look at somebody who has died, I try to see how old they are, and usually they're close to if you subtract the 2 numbers, you're 1 year off because they haven't quite made it to that year yet, as strange as that may seem. Anyway, so they try to make it to their birthday. Very often the milestone date, okay, I've already said that. Religious people will tend to hold on until after select religious holidays. And I used to work in a Catholic hospital, so Christmas was huge. Oh God, the morgue would just fill up on Christmas, but especially New Year's. They just wanted that extra year on their tombstone. So New Year's was big. Sometimes some people Easter, not so many. But Catholics have saint days, and so a lot of them would try to hold on until their saint day, which was a birthday. Usually it's a birthday. Thanatologists don't want to make this studying of death too easy. They have taken words that seem to mean the same thing and given them different definitions. Bereavement is the loss of someone to whom one feels close and the process of adjusting to it. That's bereavement. Bereavement can affect all aspects of someone's life, including their social or community status or their roles. Grief is the emotional response. So bereavement is you trying to get over it, but grief is the emotional response experienced in the early stages of bereavement. Grief can range from anger to emptiness. Everybody goes through this. Both grief and bereavement tend to be defined through cultural context. So your culture will tell you how to handle these things. Mourning is the behavior that an individual participates in after the death of a loved one. This is very much culturally dictated. The Irish have all-night wakes where friends and family toast the memory of the deceased. Flying a flag at half-staff is an example of mourning. In Japan, the bereaved are encouraged to maintain contact with the deceased. They cremate their dead and place the urns in the family burial plots. They create shrines to their ancestors in their homes and feed them as if they were there. Some Southwestern Native Americans do not speak of the dead for fear of being contaminated by their dead spirit. And it's not just the Navajo, of course. There are other Native Americans from the Southwest that have these feelings. And this is one of the reasons why David felt like he needed to leave. Because as far as the people of Fort Belknap were concerned, he was supposed to talk about his dead wife. He was supposed to commune with his children about her. That was what was supposed to happen if he had been from that area. But since he was Dene, he needed to escape from that environment where he would think and talk about his wife all the time. And that's why he left and went back to Arizona. I think he was from Arizona. I think he was from Tuba City, if I'm not mistaken. He gave me a vest. He gave me a vest and it was really kind of interesting that Dave and I used to work powwows together, and we were pretty good friends. And his wife was sick with diabetes, and it was pretty obvious that whatever was happening wasn't going to work. Whatever they were doing, and she was dropping pretty quickly, and that's when he gave me the vest. He said, "I would. It's a leather vest with an American flag on the back." And he said he wanted me to have it. He couldn't wear it anymore, and it's kind of small. Dave was a big guy, and it didn't fit me either. It's a little bit small, but it was a very nice gesture, and he knew that he was going to have to leave because he knew he wasn't going to be able to do what needed to happen to make the people of Fort Belknap happy with what was going on. And they're just as collectivistic as the Dene people are. So if you don't act the right way, then that's not going to work. Patterns of grief. Anticipatory grief is a feeling of anticipatory loss that people feel before someone dies. Anticipatory grief is actually adaptive in that it tends to help the individual prepare themselves psychologically and practically for the loss of their friend or relative. And this is kind of what happened in my family. And the reason it happened this way in my family is because my mother was a nurse. And because she was a nurse and she'd watched this over and over and over again, she knew that, we were going to have to handle this because we didn't go to church. So there wouldn't be a church or a bunch of religious people telling us what we needed to do. We didn't have a ritual. So she created this idea that we didn't grieve, and that we talked about the pleasant things about people that die. And so this whole anticipatory grief thing is what we have done in our family. Now the interesting thing is I have a cousin. Uh, my cousin. My cousin just died, and she had 4 kids, and one of the kids is really having a lot of trouble dealing with her death, even though she was in her 80s. And she had cancer, and she'd had a heart attack that actually killed her, but she had had cancer before that, and they treated her for it, and she was not in very good health for an extended length of time. But this is the baby of the family. and she's having a really hard time dealing with it. The rest of the kids are okay. The other three kids are okay, but she's really struggling, and so we're having these family reunions to try to bring her out of her funk. A grief work, a thanatologist studying the process of grief discovered a three-stage pattern. Shock and disbelief is the first stage. This may last several weeks, especially if the death was unexpected. The individual feels lost and confused. They seem to be unable to believe in the death. This may actually protect them from more intense reactions. And as I have keep telling people, the human brain can only handle so much. And normally, when a situation like this occurs, in order to protect itself, it will protect itself in various ways, and one of them is to not believe something has happened that you like this death, so that your in reactions you won't go screaming down the road and not be able to scream all the way to Flagstaff or something. That's what you want to do. That's what you would do. Potentially, that's what you would do. But of course, the human brain can't handle that much trauma, so it deals with it in various ways. And one of them is to pretend, or not pretend, but to feel like it's not possible that they are dead. Normal physical reactions may include shortness of breath, tightness in the chest or throat, nausea, feeling of emptiness in the abdomen. The numbness will eventually give way to overwhelming feelings of sadness and eventually crying. Stage 2, preoccupation with the memory of the dead person. The second phase may last 6 months or more. The survivor is trying to come to terms with the loss but cannot yet accept it. Physical reactions include insomnia, frequent crying, fatigue, loss of appetite. They may relive their lives together and their entire relationship. At times, the survivor may feel that the deceased is present, even to the point of seeing their face. These episodes diminish with time, as do vivid dreams of their relationship together. And of course, there's a reason why it dissipates over time, why it diminishes over time. And the reason is because the human brain can't handle it. So it tries to get over things. If you don't get over it, you can't move forward. And of course, that's what the human brain is trying to do. Grief work resolution, the final phase, arrives when the bereaved renews interest in everyday activity. Memories of the deceased now bring fond feelings mingled with sadness, but is no longer a sharp pain and longing. And of course, this is the same thing that happens with post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder tends to dissipate over time, and the reason is because you're not remembering the negative things as strongly as you were before. Your brain is trying to forget. It's trying to forget the bad stuff. And that works. I mean, it really does work because because now now you are more likely to remember the happy stuff rather than the negative stuff. And so because the brain wants to feel positive, it will start remembering the happy times rather than the pain of losing someone. So you'll just remember them as a positive thought. They will become socially active again. The individual, this is a resolution phase. This is especially important in widowers in that they tend to have a less entwined social network. Grief therapy is counseling that can help the bereaved cope with their loss if they are having difficulty. There are many misperceptions about death and dying and grieving. And one of the things they've been doing a lot of work with this, they especially did work with this after 9/11. Uh, and what they found out was that people who had lost people in 9/11, they didn't really go through the vast majority of them didn't go through a prolonged period of grieving. About 59% handled it almost immediately. They were able to take to deal with their loss without going into any depression or anything. 41% struggled, but even the vast majority of them recovered within a relatively short period of time. There were some people that they did suffer with this for years, for a number of years, and but it was a relatively small percentage. So death, while it seems like everybody's supposed to cry and you're supposed to scream and wail and do whatever some people do, the vast majority of people are able to handle it. Some people are able to handle it almost immediately, and that's what my mother was trying to teach us to do. There are many misperceptions about death and dying and grieving. Researchers have discovered that depression is far from universal. Only 15 to 35% of grieving survivors show any signs of depression. That's 15 to 35%, and this is relatively soon afterwards. Failure to show distress at the outset does not necessarily lead to problems. In fact, the people who showed the most distress were more likely to still be troubled after 2 years. Not everyone needs to work through a loss of benefits from doing so. Some people who worked through their grief had the most severe problems. Surviving spouses, not only do women tend to live longer than men, but in the majority of the marriages in the United States, the woman marries an older man, as did my wife. She is 2.5 years younger than I am. Widows tend to be worse off economically than widowers. In the United States, 40% of women over 65 are widowed. In the United States, 14% of men over 65 are widowed. Among women who are over 85, 80% are widowed. Among men over 85, only 43% are widowed and not married. The average white woman is widowed at 56, African American woman at 49, the Hispanic woman at 48. Losing a parent, half of all children become orphaned by the time they are in their mid-50s. Let me see. My dad died in 2008. My mom died in 2014. I was 51. I was 60. I was 60 when my dad died. I still wasn't an orphan. I had a mother. Wait a minute. 6 years later. Okay. I was 66 when my mother died. 75% by the time they reach their 60s. Grieving for parents may last longer than for other deaths. 25% of bereaved adults still had emotional problems 1 to 5 years after the death of their parents. And of course, as I've already explained, my mother taught us not to do that. This included sadness, depression, thoughts of suicide. And of course, I didn't go through any of that. 50% continued to have physical reactions in the form of illness, fatigue, and general decline in health, and none of that happened. Euthanasia is the act of allowing or assisting someone to die. Euthanasia has been practiced in the United States for decades. Doctors who have wanted to stop the pain and suffering of a terminal patient would merely stop making overt attempts to keep them alive. Withholding or discontinuing life-sustaining treatment is known as passive euthanasia. Dr. Jack Kevorkian, however, actively assisted people in seeking their death, and this is known as assisted suicide. Even before Erickson, people tended to review their lives before they died. This is referred to by thanatologists as a life review. Life reviews seem to be beneficial for all people, but especially those who look back and saw a true purpose in their lives. These tended to be the people who feared death the least. Ritual is important for Hinduism, which includes bathing the body with holy water and draped with white cloth, sprinkling rice on the mouth, cremation with only men present. Ashes are scattered on the 31st day. A memorial service is held after that. Now, this is really kind of interesting because the cremation has to be done by people that are unclean or the pariah. I can't think of what the other word for it is, but it's done by a certain caste of individuals in India. Buddhism rituals include presence of monks is important, bathing ceremony after the death, cremation, a feast held on the day of cremation, continual prayers performed by monks, and that's why monks are so important. Judaism tends to have a community of volunteers. Body is washed and purified. The body is dried and wrapped in linen. Family members enter 7-day mourning period followed by a second 30-day period. The coffin can have no nails or no handles. There can't be anything metal holding the coffin together. And I used to work in a cemetery, Riverside National Cemetery, and we had to put we were the ones that lowered the caskets into the ground, and it's really tough with a Jewish casket because they have no handles. So you kind of have to. We would not only have two people at the end, but we'd have like two people on each side. Then we put it on the ropes and lowered it into the grave. Two major mourning traditions in Christianity, Catholic anointing the sick, followed by a vigil and a requiem mass is held. The Protestants may have a funeral service which includes a eulogy. Protestant tradition is less ritualized than Catholic tradition. Islamic rituals include gathering near deathbed and reciting the Quran. Body is bathed and burial takes place shortly after death. Cremation is forbidden. Body laid on the right side facing Mecca. 3-day mourning period with wives mourning for 4 months and 10 days. And the interesting thing about the Jewish burial rites and the Islamic is that they have to be buried within 24 hours after they die. Go at that. Oh, I thought that was it. Remembering and honoring the dead, the Hindu, a year anniversary of death of the deceased, where their favorite food is prepared. Buddhists, they have ancestor worship, so you will go back every year. You'll go back and you will talk to them and go to your family burial place. Since Buddhists cremate their dead, there is no actual grave, and you can put, grandpa's there, grandma's there. Everybody is there in their funeral urns. Jewish Yahrzeit, candlelit for 24 hours and prayer recited 3 times. Christian have a 3-day period called All Hallows Eve, where that's where Halloween comes in. Muslims visit graves, they show respect and offer prayers. And that is the end of that. This is the last chapter. I mean, what more could we talk about human development than the death process? So, okay, I've had a good semester. I'll see you again later, maybe, if that's the way it works.